Thank you once more. I am very much aware that this is the worst possible time of the day to be lecturing, and I am torn between the desire to be more bouncy and entertaining and keep you awake, and on the other hand, possibly to lull you to sleep so that when I say the truly heretical thing, you will all be snoring and won't notice it. We shall see. Paul's rethinking of the meaning of the word God, which is what I was talking about this morning, obviously, dovetails naturally with his rethinking of what it meant to be God's people. And just as the belief in the one God wasn't simply a matter of working out intellectual puzzles, but also, necessarily granted who this one God was, a matter of worship, praise, prayer, and loyal service, so the belief in God's people is not simply a matter of theory for Paul, but also necessarily granted who this people is, a matter of apostolic work to found and nurture communities of faith. So, election, Jewish views of God's people, and then to the redefinitions. It has become something of a mantra in New Testament studies that there were many Judaisms, plural, in Paul's day. But of course, for there to be a plural, there must also be a singular. That is the theme on which those pluralities represent variations. In addition, there will always be questions about how well Paul knew and represented his own native Judaism, or to put it another way, how representative the Judaism he described and engaged with may have been of the wider picture at the time. Recent attempts to suggest a more variegated attitude to the law than was allowed for by E.P. Sanders in Paul and Palestinian Judaism are undoubtedly right to stress that variety, and undoubtedly wrong to try to use that variety as a way of smuggling back into the picture an anachronistic vision of a Pelagian or semi-Pelagian or medieval works righteousness. I shall be in implicit debate in this lecture, in the details of the exegesis and the structure of the thought, both with the so-called new perspective and with its current opponents, but in this lecture I won't have time for any hand-to-hand fighting. My aim is a more strategic outflanking, both of Sanders and what he's done, and of the critics of the new perspective on the other. The belief that Israel was the chosen people of the Creator God is everywhere apparent in the Old Testament and the Second Temple literature, and indeed in all that we know of the praxis and the symbolic world of both ancient Israel and first century Judaism. The great stories which Israel told year by year in the festivals and so on were designed to celebrate and reinforce this covenant status, often in the teeth of contrary evidence. You know, when you're being beaten up by all the other nations around, it's quite difficult to say, our God is the creator and sovereign of the world. It is really difficult, actually. We hardly need rehearse the stories of the patriarchs and the Exodus and conquest, the monarchy and its problems, the prophetic tradition of calling Israel back to her God, or the Psalms which simultaneously celebrate Israel's special status and lament Israel's failure to live up to its calling. All through it was a basic belief that the one creator God had called Israel to be his special people, and as part of that call had given Israel the land to live in and the law to live by. When Israel asked why it had been chosen, the answer came back from Deuteronomy in particular that it was purely a matter of God's love. It wasn't because you were a great and wonderful and powerful nation. In fact, you were the most trivial and insignificant of all the nations. It was because I love you, says the Lord in Deuteronomy 7. But when Israel asked what purpose God had in mind in this choice, the ultimate answer came back in a variety of ways which were variously embraced, then lost sight of, distorted and re-emphasized and picked up again down the years. For the writer of Genesis, as I said this morning, the call of Abraham was God's answer to the problem of Adam, which had become the problem of Babel, and through that, the problem of the wider world, the cosmos. Human rebellion had led to arrogance, to pride, to the fracturing of human life, and to the dislocation of creation. The canonical Old Testament frames the entire story of God's people as the divine answer to the problem of evil. Somehow, through this people, God is going to deal with the problem that has infected his good creation in general and his image-bearing creatures in particular. Israel is to be God's royal nation of holy priests, chosen out of the world, but also chosen for the sake of the world. Israel is to be the light of the world. The nations will see in Israel what it means to be truly human and hence who the true God really is. And for this purpose, Israel is given Torah. As the psalmist remarks, this makes Israel different from everybody else. This whole theology of election is stated classically in the Exodus story and reinforced by regular repetition and multiple subsequent allusions. It is put to the test in the events of exile, but again and again it is reaffirmed through that tragedy. Indeed, the great achievement of the exilic writers, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on, and whenever you date it, actually 2nd Isaiah, is to say that despite all the tragedy that has occurred, Israel is still the covenant people charged with this responsibility, and that somehow through these tragedies, that responsibility will eventually be fulfilled. The prophets declare that the people who are the bearers of God's solution to the problem have become part of the problem. And the Old Testament writers address this problem, and as they do so, they find ways of declaring that Yahweh will nevertheless fulfill both the original promise through Israel and the contingent purpose for Israel. All this was worked out in various ways in the Second Temple period. Worsening pagan oppression led to sundry reassertions of Israel's status as God's chosen people, to efforts to sustain and develop obedience to the Torah, to attempts to purify the land, not least by getting rid of pagan oppressors. Election was, as I said, closely bound up with eschatology. Because Israel was the one people of the Creator God, this God would soon act to vindicate Israel by liberating it from its enemies. Different writers drew the conclusion in different ways. Some documents, like the Psalms of Solomon, envisage a fulfillment of Psalm 2 with Israel under the Messiah smashing the Gentiles to pieces with a rod of iron. Others, not least some of the rabbis in the Hillelite tradition, envisage a redemption which, once it's happened to Israel, will then spread out so that the nations are embraced by it as well. Both of these represent natural developments of the doctrine of election itself. And this is the point. Because Israel was the chosen people of the Creator God, when God did for Israel what God was going to do for Israel, however that was conceived, then the Gentiles would at last be brought into the picture, whether in judgment or blessing or both. That sentence is so important, I'm going to say it again. When God did for Israel what God was going to do for Israel, whether in judgment or blessing or whatever, then the Gentiles would be brought into the picture, whether in judgment or blessing or whatever. One way or another, God's purpose in election, which was to root evil out of the world and to do so through Israel, would be fulfilled. This, by the way, is what I would mean if I were to use that phrase, redemptive historical. I was thinking when Professor Gaffin and I were talking about that this morning, of the celebrated question which Karl Barth asked Ernst Käsemann when they met on one occasion. Barth said he wanted to know, in the phrase historical critical, historisch kritisch in German, he said, what is the meaning of historical? What is the meaning of critical? And particularly, what is the meaning of the hyphen in between those two words? I have similar questions about redemptive historical. We'll come back to that. So much for a summary which is already too brief but too long. We must hurry on. Paul's exposition of the way in which, through Jesus and the Spirit, Israel's God had reshaped the doctrine of election itself. So first, election reshaped around Jesus. As with monotheism, Paul reaffirmed Israel's election even at the moments when he was redefining it. Romans 9:4, they are Israel, and to them belong the sonship, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promises, the patriarchs, and the Messiah himself. For Paul, this is non-negotiable, and this is part of the glory and the puzzle of his theology. How much easier it would have been, intellectually, politically, personally, if, as many have imagined, Paul were to construct a theology in which Israel's election was either ignored or overthrown or simply left statically in place without redefinition. But Paul refuses. God will be true to his original promises, even though all humans, Israel included, are false. Romans 3:1-4. It is natural for Paul to go back to Abraham, as he does in Galatians and Romans, not merely incidentally. Oh, by the way, I can think of an interesting example, and it's that fellow, what was he called? Oh, yes, Abraham. Let's go and grab him from Genesis and use it. No. Or in order to take on particular opponents. You know, some exegetes have said, well, Paul wouldn't, of course, have brought Abraham into the argument, but his opponents were always talking about Abraham, so Paul had to trundle back and get out his Bible and read Genesis 15 again. Oh, yeah, I can do something with that. No, of course not. And yet great swathes of exegesis and theology have treated Paul's treatment of Abraham as though that's what was going on. No. It is natural for Paul to go back to Abraham because he really does reaffirm, as one of the rabbis put it in Genesis Rabbah, that God said, I will make Adam first, and if he goes wrong, I will send Abraham to sort it all out. Paul would basically have agreed with that, although he would have said, of course, that Abraham sorts it all out by being the promise bearer who looks forward to the Messiah who comes as the climax of his family. So Paul really does reaffirm the election of Israel from the patriarchs onwards, but the doctrine has also been redefined, and the obvious place is to begin with Galatians. Galatians 2:11-21. I've spoken about it already. Paul homes in on the crucial issue between him and Peter in Antioch. What does it mean in practical terms to be a member of God's people? The discussion only makes sense if we assume that the Christian community in Antioch has been living in some sense as the renewed Israel, and that they now face the question of whether or not uncircumcised Gentiles count as members of that company, or whether they belong at a separate table. Verses 14 and 15 indicate that the question, what does it mean to be a Jew, lies behind the argument. Paul says to Peter, if you, though you are a Jew, live Gentilely, ethnikos, rather than Jewishly, how can you force Gentiles to Judaize? Peter, by separating himself from uncircumcised believers, is implying that if they want to belong to God's people, they must take on themselves the identity of ethnic Jews by getting circumcised. There then follows the first ever statement of Paul's doctrine of justification by faith. And despite the shrill chorus of detractors, it here obviously refers to the way in which God's people have been redefined. We, affirms Paul, are by birth Jews, not Gentile sinners. This is where we were last night. Yet we know that one is not justified by works of Torah, but through the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. Thus we too have believed in the Messiah Jesus, so that we might be justified by the faithfulness of the Messiah and not by works of Torah, because through works of Torah no flesh will be justified. There's enough there to keep us going all day, of course. Let me simply spell out 3 points. First, I have translated pistis Christou and similar phrases as a reference not to human faith in the Messiah, but to the faithfulness of the Messiah, which, as we were saying before lunch, I understand not as Jesus' own faith in the sense of his belief or trust in God, but to his faithfulness, his faithful fulfilling of the divine plan for Israel, which he was representing as Messiah. That's the first thing. Second thing, the passage works far better if we see the meaning of justified not as a statement about how someone becomes a Christian, but as a statement about who belongs to the people of God and how you can tell that in the present. I suspect that my quarrel here is more with not particularly Reformed evangelicalism than with the Reformed tradition, though I'm aware that in much modern Christianity of various sorts, the word justified is used among other terms as a general word to describe or denote what happens when someone becomes a Christian. That is, as I'm saying, not what Paul is doing with it. Third, the point of works of Torah here is not about the works that some might think you have to perform in order to become a member of God's people. That's the climbing up the ladder of works in order to earn your salvation thing. No, the works of Torah here are the works that you might do in order to demonstrate that you are a member of God's people. And these works, Paul says, simply miss the point. Psalm 143 verse 2 had indicated that nobody ever performs them adequately. No flesh shall be justified in your sight. Partly also because here, as in Romans 3, works of Torah would, left to themselves, create a family which was at best an extension of ethnic Judaism. Whereas, the great theme of Galatians, God desires a family of all peoples, the point which is emphasized particularly in Galatians 3. The rest of the paragraph spells out the results, and it highlights the way this extraordinary redefinition of God's people has been effected through the Messiah, and specifically through his death. Galatians 2:17 and 18 face the question of what happens when we, or then I, find ourselves thus redefined. Think of it, Paul the Jew, Saul of Tarsus, he's become now a member of the Messiah's family. He's now sharing table fellowship with Gentile sinners. Does this make him a sinner? No, on the contrary. If instead, like Peter and Barnabas are wanting to do, he goes back within the high protective walls erected by Torah all around Israel, all he will discover is that the Torah itself will declare that he's a transgressor. If I rebuild that which I destroyed, the Torah as the fence around me, I merely prove myself a transgressor. If I go back to hide in the law to gain my identity as the people of God, I will discover that the law, when I do that, says, guess what, you've broken me. That's how the argument works. There is a straight line from this point to Romans 7, where the I of Galatians 2:18 has nearly a whole chapter to itself, but that's another story. What follows is central to Paul's messianic redefinition of election, continuing with the I, which doesn't refer to some private spiritual experience that Paul has had. People sometimes read Galatians 2 as though this was Paul saying, I've had this wonderful spiritual experience of co-crucifixion with the Messiah, etc. To which Peter and others might respond, well, I'm so glad you've had that experience, but I haven't, so it's irrelevant for me. The point of Paul telling this is not that this is his subjective experience, though no doubt it was that as well, but that this is the theological truth of what happens when someone comes from the world of Torah into the family of the Messiah. I, through the law, died to the law that I might live to God. This typically compressed statement, of course, like a lot of Paul, needs a lot of unpacking, but basically it describes a dying and a coming to new life. Resurrection itself, we note, is a major theme of an election-shaped eschatology in this period, through which a new identity has emerged, the new identity which underpins the stance Paul has taken in verses 11 to 16. He then explains more specifically, I have been crucified with the Messiah. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but the Messiah lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Many elements of Paul's thought come together here to explain his redefinition of election. The Messiah represents his people so that what is true of him is true of them. He has been crucified, therefore they have now been crucified with him. In Romans 6, Paul ties this to baptism. They now share his new life, not defined in terms of sarkic, fleshly identity, that is of Jewish ethnicity, but in terms of the Messiah's own new life, a life in which all nations can share equally. If you doubt that that's the point, just read on through Galatians 3. The energy driving this redefinition is nothing other than the love of the Messiah himself. just as in Deuteronomy, remember, the reason for election was simply the love of Yahweh for Israel. Paul is explicitly redefining that Jewish doctrine. He then describes it in terms of grace. If he were to follow Peter and the others in rebuilding the wall that separates Jews and Gentiles, he would be rejecting the grace of God. The final sentence there in Galatians 2 is a cornerstone of a theologically reoriented version of the new perspective on Paul. If righteousness, dikaiosune, came by Torah, then the Messiah died in vain, or to no good purpose. Note here that in context, righteousness, dikaiosune, must refer to one's status as a member of God's people. Status as a member of God's people. Righteousness here means covenant status or covenant membership. Paul is denying that this covenant status is defined by Torah, which it would be if Peter and the others had their way. He is denying that Christians should separate for meals, with Jews at one table and uncircumcised Gentiles at the other. The doctrine of justification by faith was born into the world as the key doctrine underlying the unity of all God's people in Christ. This is worked out in detail in the following chapter, where, as I've argued at length elsewhere, the main theme is the fact that God has one family, not two, and that this family consists of all those who believe in the gospel. Because it's 2:30 on a warm afternoon, I shall tell you a story about something that happened to me in 1983 at the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting, where I was having dinner in the restaurant in the hotel with Lloyd Gaston from Vancouver, who, as some of you will know, is one who in this last generation has argued relentlessly that Paul thought that Jews got saved by being Jews and that Christians got saved by being Christians, and never the twain did meet. And by the time we were well into our main course, we'd both got our Greek Testaments out and we'd got Galatians 3 open on the table, and we were hammering away at it like this. And this was in Los Angeles. No, not, I forget. Maybe it was in Los Angeles. Anyway, the waitress came to take our dessert order, and the waitress was a splendid lady of whom, to put it charitably, the adjective slim, had it ever been applied, would have been some years previously. And And this lady towered over our table and said, "Well, gentlemen, are you ready for dessert?" And Lloyd Gaston said, "Galatians 3 and ice cream, please." And the waitress stared at him and he said, "What did you say?" And he said, "Galatians 3 and ice cream, please." And she swung round at me and said, "What are you two talking about?" And I said, "Well, my friend here would disagree, but I'm saying that Paul says that God has one family, not two, and that family consists of all those who believe in Jesus Christ." And the waitress swung round to Lloyd Gass and said, "And you don't believe that?" She said, "Listen, buddy, I'm a born-again Christian. The Bible is the word of God. If you don't believe that, you're going to hell." And then... And then she stomped off to get the ice cream, leaving Lloyd and me still talking about Galatians 3. Anyway, the point of Galatians 3 is the single family promised to Abraham. Look at the punchline at the end. If you want to know where Paul's arguments go, look at the punchline at the end of the chapter. He doesn't say, "If you're Abraham's seed, therefore you're in Christ." He says, "And if you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." That's what the chapter's about. Who are the family of Abraham? And the answer is God has one seed for Abraham, and that is all those who are en Christo. And so strong is the incorporative sense of this word Christos that in verse 16 he can confuse us all who'd forgotten it by saying that the single seed simply is Christ. He means the family, the one family. And in verses 23 to 29, he just puts it all together. Those who believe, who are baptized into the Messiah, have come into the Messiah, they've put on the Messiah, they belong to the Messiah, they are in the Messiah. And this is the single family. God's people are thereby marked out, note, not simply against unbelieving Jews, but far more importantly against the wider world of paganism. This redefinition is then rooted, as we saw in the last lecture, in the redefinition of God himself as the one who sends the Son and the one who sends the Spirit. I skipped to 3 verses almost at the end of Galatians. In 6:14 to 16, Paul returns to what he'd said in chapter 2. The crucifixion of the Messiah means that everything has been turned inside out, not simply his own self, not simply Israel, but the entire cosmos. The world is crucified to me and I to the world. He thereby locates himself on the larger map of the purposes of God. I sometimes think as I get older that one of the things I just have to go on banging on about till the day I die is to get this larger map into the present consciousness of the people of God in this generation. The larger map of the purposes of God, which always stretched out through Israel to the restoration of the whole creation. What matters is neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, but kainektisis, new creation. And from here there's a straight line, as Professor Gaffin said before, to 2 Corinthians 5, and more especially to Romans 8. Paul is not just speaking of the individual Christian as a new creation, though of course that is true as well. In fact, it's more than just true. If you are in Christ, you are kainektisis because it's true of you in order that it may be true of the world. You are to be an agent as well as a beneficiary of that new creation, but of the entire renewal of the cosmos in which the Christian is invited to be a participant. And then in true Jewish style, Paul invokes a blessing on those who walk according to this rule as opposed to the rule of Torah. Peace and mercy on them, yes, even on God's Israel. In the light of the entire argument of the letter, I cannot agree with those who have pleaded that the Israel of God in this verse denotes some subset of ethnic Judaism over against the people of God renewed in the Messiah. Paul has spent most of the letter explaining that God always intended to give Abraham a single family and that he's now done so in the Messiah. It would be special pleading based shakily on a misreading of Romans 9 to 11 to suggest that God's Israel here is anything other than the renewed family, the Messiah and his people. It is, of course, a polemical redefinition. Paul has saved it as a final crucial point with which to round off the letter. This points on to one of the other great passages where election is redefined, Philippians chapter 3. The chapter begins after the cryptic first verse with several polemical redefinitions. Watch out for the dogs. Watch out for the workers of evil. Watch out for the mutilation. The Greek word is katatome, which is a contemptuous pun on peritome, circumcision. This indicates where the line of thought is going. Israel is redefined. The covenant people is radically redrawn around the Messiah himself. Hemis gar he peritome. If you know your Greek and note both the emphasis and the definite article, you might want to translate circumcision, that's us. Not, we note, the true circumcision, simply the circumcision, just as in Romans 2:25 to 9. And the us is defined as those who worship God in spirit, who boast in Messiah Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh. The flesh which, as we've seen before, is one of Paul's regular ways not only of denoting Israel according to the flesh, but of aligning that Israel with the corruptible fleshliness of all humankind. This is where Paul's critique joins hands with that of the prophets. Israel is the bearer of the solution to the world's ills, but Israel has itself become part of the problem. Paul then launches into his mini-autobiography, Philippians 3, 4, 5, 6-ish. He had all the privileges and pride of status you could possibly want as a Jew, and the crown of the list, verse 6, was the status of dikaiosune, covenant membership, defined by Torah. He didn't just possess Torah, he was amemptos, blameless in his keeping of it, which presumably means, as any first century Jew would have told you, that whenever he accidentally did something which was against Torah, he would go and offer the relevant sacrifice and put it all right again. There follows a clear, if as usual, dense statement of the redefinition of election around the Messiah. All this gain he counted as loss through the Messiah. In fact, he says, I count everything as loss because of the knowledge of the Messiah, Jesus my Lord, which goes far beyond everything else. Because of him, I threw it all away as so much garbage so that I could gain the Messiah and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own arising from Torah, but that which is through the faithfulness of the Messiah, the righteousness from God, which is upon faith, knowing him, sharing his sufferings, conformed to his death, in the hope of the ultimate resurrection from the dead. Now, as in Galatians 2, all is focused here on the Messiah's dying and rising, which have brought God's people out from under Torah and any sense of being defined by it, and have given them instead a new covenant status based on the achievement of the Messiah and bestowed upon those who now believe the gospel. Note particularly, because this is often misunderstood, the status which Paul describes in verse 9 as belonging to those in the Messiah is not the righteousness of God, that is God's own righteousness. It is the righteousness from God. He ek theou dikaiosune. That's a critical distinction. This phrase is not a parallel, as is still often asserted, with dikaiosune theou, the righteousness of God, in Romans 10:3. Of course, the passages are ultimately quite closely related, but they're not identical. What matters here is the status of covenant membership, which Paul claims in the Messiah to be the gift from God as God's own righteousness, which is his faithfulness to the covenant and ultimately to creation itself. Now, with Galatians and Philippians behind us, there are many other passages we could explore which fill in the picture, lots in 1 Corinthians, lots in Ephesians. I just want to drop in this little gem from Colossians. I love Colossians 2. Paul says, you've already been circumcised, verse 11. The Torah has nothing more to say to you because of the cross, verse 14. You died and rose again, just as just in Galatians 2. That's Colossians 2:20 and 3:1. And you must let that redefined identity determine your path to holiness, rather than hoping to attain the goal of holiness by taking on yourself the regulations of Torah, 2:16 to 23. In other words, 2:8, Colossians 2:8, don't let anyone lead you away captive. But the word Paul uses for lead you away captive is a very rare verb, and it comes out as sylagogon, S-Y-L-A-G-O-G-O-N, sylagogon. And I believe that, like the equivalent words in Philippians 3, is a contemptuous pun. Whether it's in cursive writing or in capitals, all you have to do is to invert the lambda, the third letter of the word, and you get synagogon, synagogon. In other words, don't let anyone synagogue you, drag you off into the synagogue. And this redefinition of election in Colossians 2 and 3 is once more based foursquare on the redefinition of monotheism, this time in Colossians 1. But it is, of course, again with Romans that the redefinition of God's people around the Messiah reaches its full height. I've written a good deal about Romans over the years. Some of you have got some of that material. God willing, there may even be more to come one day, but our present theme demands a further trawl through with our eye on this particular topic. Begin in Romans 2. Having denounced human idolatry and sin in 1:18 to 2:16, Paul turns his attention to his own former self. Let's not forget that. And those who still think as he did prior to his conversion. Verses 17 to 25 examine the Jewish claim to special status based on election and covenant. The prophets themselves, he said, find these claims undermined by Israel's sin. Let's be clear, Paul is not here talking about each individual Jew. That's not the point. He is talking about the national boast which says that we Jews are called by God to be the light of the world, a teacher of the foolish, etc., etc. But no, boasting in Torah ethnically is rendered null and void because in Israel there has been massive Torah breaking. The national boast is undermined. Israel has instead caused the pagan nations to blaspheme. The presence of sin within Israel destroys the claim that Israel as it stands is the people through whom God will accomplish his purposes in the world. The next paragraph 25 to 29, lies very close to Philippians 3, 2 to 3 in its dramatic redefinition of what it means to be circumcised. The circumcision of the heart goes back through various Second Temple passages to Jeremiah and Deuteronomy and elsewhere. It's a new covenant theme, and Paul here exploits it fully. Supposing, he muses, supposing God has created a category of people who, though they're uncircumcised, keep the Torah, and who will in fact sit in judgment on those who possess the Torah and are circumcised but break it. The last two verses of the chapter, verses 28 and 9, are the key, though their dense Greek almost defies translation. They depend for their force on another pun, this time a hidden one. The Hebrew word for praise is Yehuda, Judah, so that the very name Jew, Judaios in Greek, ought to mean praise. And this highlights what Paul is saying. The very word Judaios is now to be predicated of a different group, no longer defined ethnically or by possession of Torah, not marked out by things which are entophanero in the open or on the surface. Rather, he says, ho entokrypto Judaios, the Jew in secret. There's no verb there. Why put in a verb if you don't need to, being Paul? The Jew is the Jew who is so in secret. That's how we have to cash it out. And circumcision consists in the spirit rather than the letter. And such a person, Paul declares, with that Hebrew pun in mind, gains praise not from humans, but from God. Note, as in Philippians 3, Paul does not say the true Jew or the real circumcision. We attempted to add words like that to make the meaning easier to appropriate, to cushion our sensibilities against the blunt and clear claim. I was talking to some people on the way back in after lunch about a book which came out recently by a scholar called Doug Harink in Canada, Paul Among the Post-Liberals, where he devotes an entire chapter to calling me a supersessionist because I say some of the things I'm saying in this lecture. I went working my way through that chapter and kept on thinking, so what's he going to do with Romans 2? What's he going to do with Philippians 3? And about 4 or 5 other similar passages. And he never touched any of them. I looked in the index. There they aren't. What are you supposed to do? It's very easy to construct a Paul by ignoring half the evidence. The Messiah, though, has so far not been mentioned in this part of Romans. The passage I've just studied belongs properly, as I said, with the redefinition of election through the Spirit. But we need those verses, the end of chapter 2, as the backdrop to what happens next, in a passage which is vital for Romans and Pauline theology, but routinely neglected. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 9, which, if you look at it closely, you'll see, anticipates in microcosm the argument of Romans 9 to 11. 3, 1 to 9 is all about the election of Israel, the way in which Israel's faithlessness has threatened God's elective purpose, and the solution which God has found. Paul's point is that precisely in the Messiah, God has remained faithful to the purpose of election despite Israel's faithlessness. The key is to recognize that in 3:2 and 3:3, the point of Israel's call to be faithful is that election was never about Israel being called for its own sake, but always about God's call of Israel to be the light of the world. This is what's missing from an enormous amount of Pauline scholarship. But this is part of Paul's retelling of the story. He says Israel was entrusted with God's oracles, episteuthesan. Now, if I entrust you with a letter, the letter isn't for you, it's for someone else. I'm entrusting you to take it to someone else. Israel has been entrusted with God's oracles, the aim being that Israel would be, as it boasted, it might be the light of the world. But no, Israel has been faithless. This doesn't mean that Israel did not have faith in the sense of its own private faith, though that might be so as well. The point is that Israel has been unfaithful to the divine commission. Paul, we note, could only think and write like this if he really did believe that God had chosen Israel and had not rescinded that choice. What then is to happen? Let God be true, though all humans are false. God will keep to his plan, which was to save the world through Israel, even though the chosen people are now bound up in the problem instead of being the bringers of the solution. I hope you notice, by the way, that where people grasp that point without seeing the next point, which is that Israel's destiny is fulfilled in the Messiah. They invent a dispensationalism where a renewed ethnic Israel is still somehow going to save the world, though how becomes less and less clear with every passing day. How then will God do this? How will God keep the promises he made to Abraham and his family? If, as part of the terms of the covenant, Israel is to be the means of God addressing and dealing with the problem of evil, how can that plan go ahead? That is the problem of the righteousness of God. How is God going to be faithful to the covenant, granted everything that's happened? And it is to this precise problem, not simply the problem of universal human sin, that's contained within it, that Romans 3:21 to 26 is addressed in another typically dense yet powerful statement. And at its heart we discover, as we discovered last night in relation to 3:27 to 31, Paul is once more redefining around the Messiah what it means to be the people of God. 3:21, God's covenant faithfulness is revealed through the faithfulness of the Messiah for the benefit of all who believe, Jew and Gentile alike. That's the point. This is my primary reason for understanding Pistis Christou here and elsewhere as a reference to the Messiah's faithfulness to God's plan rather than to our human belief or trust in him. Though I'm not ruling out that, far from it, because of course then human belief and trust comes in immediately after. The point about the Messiah's faithfulness is that it's another way of referring to his obedience, as in Romans 5 and Philippians 2, and it's a way of denoting the same thing while connoting that faithfulness which was required under God's covenant plan. And as soon as we ask what this faithfulness, this obedience, consisted in, Philippians 2 and the whole of Romans 1 to 8 give the answer. It was the Messiah's sacrificial death. This is at the heart of the redefinition of election around the Messiah, that through his death, explored from all kinds of angles in this letter and elsewhere, God's purpose to deal with sin and evil and rescue the world and the human race from them has at last been accomplished. The Messiah has done that for which Israel was called in the first place. His death, densely described in 3:24 to 26, has made the atonement through which all nations are redeemed. God's faithfulness is therefore fully and finally unveiled in the cross. The Messiah has done for the world what Israel was called to do. He has done in Israel's place what Israel was called to do but could not, namely to act on behalf of the whole world. God set him forth as a hilasterion, a propitiatory atoning sacrifice. And all those who believe the gospel message of his death and resurrection are now themselves accorded the status of dikaios, righteous, forgiven, within the covenant. Here, as elsewhere, the cross of the Messiah lies at the heart of the reworking of election of God's people. This passage, and particularly the verses which follow, show how impossible it is, therefore, to separate the doctrine of justification by faith from that of the incorporation of Gentiles into the people of God. That's where it was all going. The attempt to screen that out could only even begin by screening out the larger theology in which Paul fully shares and shrinking the whole argument to nothing but an individualistic, ahistoricized, and decovenantalized parody. A person, Paul concludes, is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Otherwise, God would be God of the Jews only, not of Gentiles also, as I said last night. And then we lead straight into Romans 4, which is not a proof from Scripture of this doctrine, but an exposition of the covenant which God made with Abraham in Genesis 15. The inclusion of Gentiles had always been what God had in mind, and the defining characteristic of that single family had always been faith in God, the Creator and life-giver. So how then does justification work? I sketched this briefly last night, and I just need to fill it in a bit more. This lecture is going on a bit. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my watch and going rather fast, but there we are. Paul has already spoken in Romans 2, we said in the Q&A before, about the final justification of God's people on the basis of their whole life. This will take place at the end when God judges the secrets of all hearts through the Messiah. And the point of justification by faith coming from Romans 2 forward into Romans 3 is that it takes place in the present time, en to nun kairo, as opposed to on the last day. It has to do with the questions, who now belongs to God's people and how can you tell? And the answer is all who believe in the gospel belong. And that is the only way you can tell, not by who their parents were or how well they've obeyed Torah or any other moral code or whether they've been circumcised or keep kosher or anything else. Justification for Paul is a subset of election. That is, it belongs as part of his doctrine of the people of God. And that is not to scrunch soteriology under ecclesiology in some nasty, dangerous, pseudo-Roman way. It is to be deeply obedient to the Jewish deep structure of Paul's thought. And of course, this does not mean, despite many efforts to push the conclusion this way, that this therefore has nothing to do with sinners being saved from sin and death by the love and grace of God. No, the point of election always was that humans were sinful, the world was lapsing back into chaos, and God had to mount a rescue operation. That's why there was a covenant in the first place. That's why belonging to the covenant means, among other things, forgiven sinner. The point is that the word justification does not denote the process whereby or the event in which a person is brought by grace from unbelief, idolatry, and sin into faith, true worship, and renewal of life. Paul uses a different word for that, the word call. The word justification, despite centuries of Christian misuse, is used by Paul to denote what happens immediately after the call. Those God called, he also justified. Those who hear the gospel and respond to it in faith are then declared by God to be his people, his elect, the circumcision, the Jews, the Israel of God. They are given the status dikaios, within the covenant. But the word call itself and the fact that justification is not about how I get saved, but how I am declared to be a member of God's people, must always have an eye to the larger purposes of the covenant. Indeed, to forget this, as has often been done within Western theology, both Catholic and Protestant, is to make a mistake not too unlike that for which Paul chides his fellow countrymen. I spoke of this morning. The point of the covenant was to deal with idolatry and sin in order that the world as a whole could be rescued. And there is no question once we read Romans 5 through 8 at a run that that's where Paul intends the argument to go. The point of human beings being called by the gospel to turn from their idolatry and sin and worship the true and living God is both that they might themselves be rescued and that through their rescue and the new community they then form, God's purposes to rescue the whole world might then be advanced. And that's why in Romans 5:17, Paul speaks of the justified reigning in life. The aim is not simply that they should themselves be rescued from disaster, but that through them God will rule his new creation. And that is why, too, the coming together of Jews and Gentiles in the one family is so central to justification. It isn't simply, as Steve Westerholm has said in his new book, about making life easier for Gentile converts who might balk at the thought of circumcision. It is, as Ephesians 3 saw so gloriously, that through this creation of a united Jew plus Gentile family, the living God might declare to the principalities and powers that their time is up and that the project of new creation and new humanity has been decisively launched. The rethinking of election around the Messiah and its reworking by Paul in his apostolic labors to generate and sustain exactly this kind of community holds together elements of his thought which centuries of alternative systems have forced apart. And I have to say that as I have reflected on these themes over the last years, I have wondered sometimes what subtexts are going on when people have so shrilly and stoutly resisted the conclusion that I've just drawn. I'm nearly done, but I may have, like Professor Gaffin, to leave some of this lecture to spill over to the next one. I'm trying not to do that. I just want to go very quickly to some aspects of the redefinition of election through the Spirit. Romans 2:25-9, I've already spoken about. 2 Corinthians 3, I've written about in my book, The Climax of the Covenant, the transformation of covenant membership in the Spirit, a fascinating and detailed passage, and also Romans 7 and 8. The major theme which marks out Paul's theology of God's people as renewed through the Spirit is the renewed call to holiness. A holiness not defined by Torah, and yet in much of what Paul says he can draw upon Torah, both for outline guidance and for what we might call the heart of the matter. We were discussing this last night, some of us, and pointing out that in Romans 8, 5, 6, and 7, Paul says very interestingly that it is the mind of the flesh which is hostile to God and does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it can't. And those who are in the flesh can't please God. But then he goes on to say, but you are not in the flesh, you're in the Spirit. And everything that he's actually saying there in chapter 8 and then in the middle of chapter 10 implies that those who are in Christ and indwelt by the Spirit do, in fact, in a strange new way, fulfill the Torah, even though they don't have to get circumcised, even though they don't have to keep the kosher laws, even though they don't have to keep all the Jewish festivals, and so on. This is, in other words, a holiness which comes from the heart, and it is a holiness which ought to make the pagan nations see who the living God really is. In other words, it isn't just a matter of, now you've got saved, this is how to believe. It is a matter of the genuine humanness envisaged as God's will for Israel, now being attained through the Spirit by God's renewed people. And it's summed up well at the start of Romans 12 in the appeal for self-offering and transformation through the renewal of the mind, resulting in the mutual upbuilding of those who, though many, are one body in the Messiah. What we're actually dealing with here, and this relates to some of the key debates going on, at least in my church, is the explicit undoing and reversal of the decline and decay of humanness as described in 1:18-32, not least those bits about sexual reorientation in the middle of that passage. In other words, those in the Messiah and transformed by the Spirit are to be humans put back together again. There is much more to say about how Paul reconfigures election by the Spirit, but that may point us in the right direction. Some words as I move rapidly towards my conclusion, some brief words about Romans 9-11, which I've written about at length, and if you want to know more about what I think there, it is in the commentary. Among other reasons for considering it remarkable that Paul has done what he's done in Romans 9-11, is the way in which the Messiah is hardly mentioned, 9:5 and 10:4-13, and the Spirit not at all after the opening remark about Paul's conscience bearing him witness in the Spirit that he has unceasing grief in his heart. Some have suggested, I think of Christa Stendahl, that this is because Paul is trying to find a way of affirming the forward pathway of unbelieving Israel independent of the Messiah and the Spirit. I think that's totally wrong. It's actually disproved by 10:4-13, which I mentioned in the previous lecture, and which occupies a central place in the section. And there it is clear that Paul believes that the events concerning Jesus are the fulfillment of the covenant-renewing, exile-restoring, or returning after exile promises in Deuteronomy 30. That therefore those who wish to be part of that covenant renewal and return from exile must come to faith in the Messiah. And incidentally, we were talking about the evidence for return from exile in Paul. Deuteronomy 30 in Romans 10 is where I would start, and then I would go to the similar use of Deuteronomy 30 in the middle of Galatians 3, but we may talk about that on another occasion. Likewise, Paul's quotation from Joel in 10:13 indicates, at least to those able to decode the echoes, that a theology of the Spirit is strongly implied here as well. In other words, that in this section Paul is drawing on the themes he set out earlier in the letter. And if anything, I think the apparent reticence of the section has more to do with tactics. Paul wants the Roman church to be able to think the story through for themselves, the whole Israel story, without having kind of easy shortcuts. This is like what he does often in his ethics. He doesn't just quote a rule. You know the old saying, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, teach someone to fish and you feed them for life. Often when Paul is writing to his converts, he could have come up with a rule of thumb which should have seen them round the present immediate crisis, but they still wouldn't have learned how to think Christianly. Often what Paul is doing is going back to first principles, telling them how to tell the scriptural story from the beginning, so that they will then be able to go on inhabiting it for themselves, even where he's not there to spell it out in detail. Romans 9 to 11 is in fact a massive retelling of the scriptural narrative. I just want to stress here that that passage as a whole, though it does not say very much about the Messiah and the Spirit, is in fact shaped according to the pattern which elsewhere Paul works out very explicitly in those terms. It is as though Paul, soaked in the thought which he's expressed in Galatians 2:11 to 21 and similar passages I've mentioned above, as though having soaked himself thus, he is then determined to think through what it means to say that the Messiah is Israel's Messiah according to the flesh, and also God over all, blessed forever. And what we see worked out in 9 to 11, in other words, is the Messiah-shaped pattern of Israel's history, with the Spirit-driven pathway to covenant renewal blazed through the middle of it. As in 11:11 following, Israel itself is cast away for the reconciliation of the world, and thus can and will be received back again with a meaning nothing short of life from the dead. Paul has so retold the story of Israel according to the messianic pattern worked out earlier in the letter, that when we stand back and look at the picture as a whole, what strikes us is not the relative absence of Messiah and Spirit, but the fact that the whole of Israel's story is laid before us as the outworking in history of what it means that, as the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, the Messiah was crucified and raised to new life. Let me just say one extra word, which I haven't got in my text, before I just go to my conclusion, and then I'm done. I've spoken about God's ultimate intention, that through the renewed human beings in Christ, the cosmos itself would be renewed. This strikes very hard at those of us who grew up within some kind or other of a pietistic tradition which actually had a low social concern because it said that that was just oiling the wheels of a machine which was going to go over the cliff. What's the point in tinkering with the structures of society? What's the point in worrying about global warming or whatever it is? Because we know that this world is going to be jettisoned and that we, the saved, will go off to be with God elsewhere. Romans 8 ought long ago to have given the lie to any such idea. God loves the world that he's made and wants to renew it. He sees it groaning in travail, and the answer to something groaning in travail is that the new is going to be born out of the womb of the old, not that that groaning person or world is going to be left to groan forever until it dies. No. Where does that then leave us at the moment? There are many people who will see this picture and then will say, well, that's great. We're going to get that renewal. One day when the Messiah comes back, when God renews everything, then it'll happen. But there's nothing we can do about it at the moment. Now listen, many of you are pastors. Probably the majority of you are pastors. That's why you're here. If somebody came to you and said, I'm having a real trouble with holiness, with this sin problem. I just find I sin all the time, and I see, well, there is this thing called holiness, but there's really no point in me trying very hard after it, because after all, one day, God will raise me from the dead and give me a beautiful new life in which I will never sin again. That's going to happen, so why should I worry about it now? I hope if somebody came to you like that, you would hit them with a fairly heavy dose of inaugurated eschatology. You mightn't express it quite like that, but what you would say is, God wants you right now in the present to live as nearly as you can in the power of the Spirit, to that lovely, fully human creature that you're going to be one day. Of course, you will constantly be saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But he has given you his Spirit so that you can anticipate in the present what you should be in the future. Now, should we not say the same about our responsibility for creation, for the world which God made and which he loves so much? Of course we should. And if we get our soteriology right, we can go to that task without any of those snide remarks that this is a derogation from our gospel duty. It is part of our gospel duty. Okay, I've tried to show in this lecture that as Paul did with monotheism, so with election, he rethought and reworked every element of the doctrine in the light of the Messiah and the Spirit, and that this gives the characteristic shape to his view of God's people and to the vital doctrine within that of justification. It has, of course, been traditional to locate justification within soteriology on the map of Christian dogmatics. Part of my point is that within the Jewish thought which Paul inherited, and which, though he revised it, he certainly didn't abandon it, justification is part of the larger covenant theology by which the people of God is defined. This includes soteriology, because the point of the covenant was to save the world. I do indeed, therefore, see justification as bound up with Paul's ecclesiology, but to criticize me on that account fails to notice that by ecclesiology I do not mean the sort of thing you'd get in the section on the church in a classic Protestant dogmatics. Part of my whole case is that we urgently need to rethink what we mean by ecclesiology itself in the light of the Jewish doctrine of election, and that it's only when that rethinking has been done that justification can take its proper place within it. All of this propels us forward to the third topic, which we'll get to this evening, namely that when we put together Paul's rethinking of God and his reworking of God's people, we see that together they generate and sustain the vital third element in his very Jewish theology, namely reimagining God's future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Wright. What we will do now to try to stick to our schedule is take about a 20-minute break and reconvene in here right at 3:30. So let's take a break.